Hello, fellow students of history. Today's lecture is on Reconstruction. Probably the least known eras of American history, but one of the most important. The period that was and was not, that took place but then was destroyed, um, and would take place 100 years later during the Civil Rights Revolution. A very important part of American history. So let's get into Reconstruction. Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877. Before we start our lecture, it's very important to understand the various experiences, the various lives that come together as part of this time period, Reconstruction. It's not as easy as North and South or black and white. There are different economic strata that come into play during Reconstruction. You can have someone from the South who was an elite ex-plantation owner, or someone from the South who was a poor white person, or someone from the South who was a poor working class person who was at odds or in opposition to those who were the elite. You might have someone who was born a free African American in the North, and those many 4 million people who were born as slaves and were freed after the Civil War as freedmen. We have white supremacy. We have white supremacists. We have those Northern whites who want to give complete equal rights and freedoms to newly freed African Americans. We have Northern whites who want to grant some freedoms and some rights to African Americans because they still believe in white supremacy. So you see, it's not as easy as just saying black or white or North and South. There are so many different ideas floating around at this time. Not everyone in the North wanted to give African Americans rights, or they wanted to just give them some rights. Then we have radical Republicans in the North who wanted to grant newly freed African Americans complete and equal rights. But most Northern whites didn't want that. So keep that in mind as I give this lecture. The history is nuanced, right? As you'll see in my lectures, history is nuanced. We often study history as if there were very clearly defined lines between moments, between years, between centuries, between ideas, between ideologies. But there are a lot of gray areas, and history is nuanced. So Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877. What is Reconstruction? Sorry. Reconstruction. The period immediately following the Civil War is known as Reconstruction. Reconstruction refers to the initiatives, laws, and acts enacted by the US federal government, but also the time period under study. In the aftermath of the Civil War, the South was a defeated society, and in many places in literal ruins. So remember this, keep this in mind also. Just because the Civil War ends in 1865 doesn't mean it really ends. Doesn't mean that everything is going to be okay and everything's fixed. The South is a defeated society. The South claimed independence in many ways, like the United States claimed independence from Britain and won. This is what the South does from their perspective. They claim independence, the Confederate States of America. And they said, we don't want to be part of the United States of America. We're forming a new union. And this is our culture. This is our new country. And Lincoln said, no, you're not leaving. And Lincoln went to war, not to free the slaves, as is commonly supposed. Lincoln did not go to war with the South to free the slaves. He went to war to keep the South in the Union. He said, you're not leaving. You do not have the right to form your own nation. And we're going to go to war. And 600,000 young men, mostly young men, are going to die because Lincoln wants to keep the Union together, and he succeeds, but many people die because of it. So keep this in mind that in 1865, when Lee surrenders to Grant and the Civil War is over, which means that there are no more armies fighting, the South is in ruins. The South is bitter. It's a defeated society. Many cities lay in ruins. All of us have images in our mind, right, of Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, of whole cities in ruins. Berlin after World War II, as the Allies bombed the hell out of Berlin. This is what Atlanta looks like. This is what many cities look like in the South. Their culture is destroyed. The economy is destroyed. 60,000 young men come home without arms and legs. Nearly a whole generation of young men is wiped out. And this is where we start Reconstruction at. With plantation culture and king cotton destroyed, the South was an impoverished, broken region. Southern whites face a new reality, and from their viewpoint, a nightmare. Since the early 17th century, slavery bound Blacks to define places in society, geographically, socially, mentally, and spiritually. Now, all of a sudden, after nearly 250 years, it's a long time, people they saw as subhuman were walking about wherever they chose. And the North dictated that they be free to vote, hold office, and property. Anxiety and hatred for Northern whites and Blacks filled the newspapers, groups like the KKK, and hearts and minds of Southern whites who wanted their culture back, one founded on white supremacy. And this is very important as we study Reconstruction of the Civil War, this idea of white supremacy. In many ways, the Southern culture at this time is founded upon the proposition that the white person, white men, white women, are superior in all ways to African Americans. And this is God's order. This is the way things ought to be according to their viewpoint. Socrates, Aristotle, St. Thomas Aquinas, all these ancient philosophers wrote that slavery should be part of a well-ordered society. But to them, it was never based on race. We get to the Americas and New England, and slavery becomes based upon race, which never was in past societies. It's the first time in world history where slavery is predicated upon race, directed toward African peoples. So this idea of white supremacy is very prominent during this time, and keep that in mind. I'll carry on. The Union divided the South into 5 military districts and forced the South to hold free elections and grant newly freed Blacks rights afforded to them by Congress. Washington, that's Washington, D.C., passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, guaranteeing the outlawing of slavery, the right to vote, and equal protection under the law to all American citizens, regardless of race. These are the most important aspects, the triumphal aspects of Reconstruction that make important impacts throughout history. The groundwork is laid for equal rights for all people, regardless of race. The 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments come out of Reconstruction. Very important amendments to the Constitution. When we talk about amendments, amendments means something placed upon something that already exists, right? You're amending something. So amendments mean attachments, new laws attached to the Constitution. So 13 to 14 and 15 amendments, these are new attachments to the Constitution. For every motion of legislation for Black rights, white supremacy fought back. So when Washington passes the 13th Amendment, the South lashes back. 14th, the South lashes back. 15th, and so on. And as we'll see at the end of this lecture, in many ways, the South wins out. And Reconstruction becomes the era that almost was, unfortunately. The Black Codes, the KKK, and other like-minded groups, violence, and massacres all worked toward intimidation and the mission of taking back and redeeming the South for whites. During Reconstruction, approximately 2,000 Black Americans served in office, from local positions to Congress. From 1865 to 1877, the United States experienced a civil rights revolution. African Americans had great hope for the future. Yet, in the end, white supremacy won out, and the South took back their culture and ushered in a horrible period for Black Americans, the Jim Crow era. The Civil Rights Revolution was killed and put on hold for another 100 years when people like Martin Luther King Jr. fought again. Reconstruction included two main elements. First, to bring the South back into the United States and to heal wounds left over from the Civil War. This also meant rebuilding a destroyed South. Second, to grant rights to newly freed Blacks. 4 million, keep this in mind, 4 million African Americans received freedom at the end of the Civil War. The passage of 3 amendments guaranteeing African Americans equal rights was a success and laid the groundwork for future civil rights. Yet, in 1877, it all came to a halt. The first element and goal of Reconstruction was reached. The South was brought back into the fold, and with it, white supremacy and an end to Black rights, but not forever. I wish we were in class now so we can have a discussion. All right. The next few slides are a review, just to remember what the Civil War ushered into America. By the time we get to 1865, what does the scene look like? So roughly 2% of the population, an estimated 620,000 men, mostly young men, but 620,000 men died in the line of duty. A more recent study puts the number at around 800,000 American dead. That's more than any other war the United States has fought in its history. More than World War I, more than World War II, more than Vietnam. Americans killing Americans. Americans jabbing bayonets into other Americans. Horrible, horrible, bloody war. 800,000 American dead combined North and South. I already said this. Some historians now estimate the number at 800,000. Here's a number of some of the battles. At Gettysburg, 51,000 dead in one battle. Review. So this is an image from Charleston, South Carolina, and it looks like many of the images we get from Iraq or Afghanistan or Berlin after the Allies bombed the city. This is the South at the end of the Civil War. When the Civil War was over, many parts of the South literally lay in ruins. The South was utterly defeated and devastated. Think of images you grew up with of many parts of the Middle East in ruins. This was similar to the South in many areas. Now, put yourself in the shoes of a white Southerner in Charleston, South Carolina at this time. What are you thinking? How do you view the North? How do you view African Americans who also live in Charleston, who are now free? Perhaps your dad died in the war, perhaps your brother. Now put your shoes in a newly freed African American in this city. You see it laying in ruins, but you're free. You're free. You have your freedom. Your people had been enslaved for about 250 years, and now you're free. Think of the jubilation and utter joy that you would have as a freed African American during this time. You can now walk wherever you want. Before, you couldn't leave the plantation or you were whipped. You had to get permission. You could marry husband or wife, and it would be a true marriage, and no one can break you apart. No one's going to sell your children off to another plantation, another state. No one's going to rip your baby out of your arms. No one's going to rape your wife right in front of you, or beat your wife or husband right in front of you, and there's nothing you can do about it. That's all gone now. And you're free, and you're walking around. And now you're that white person seeing these African Americans walking around who are happy in jubilation, having parades, and your life is destroyed. Think about those two different viewpoints in the streets at this time. Is it possible to bring these two groups together to create a new society? Another image of Charleston in ruins. Richmond, Virginia, in ruins. Review, Civil War review. The end of slavery meant Southern agriculture is crippled, thus shattering the Southern economy. Remember, during the early 19th century, Southern economy was booming. The Southern economy was one of the strongest economies in the world, as it produced mass amounts of cotton to supply to the North, the South, and in Europe. Europeans were eating up this cotton, right, for textiles, clothing. And many fortunes were amassed during this time by cotton farmers using slavery. But the South wasn't the only section getting rich off of cotton. The North also, because that's where the factories were that spun this cotton, cleaned the cotton, and turned it into textiles. The power of the South was destroyed. The South was very powerful in the early 19th century, leading up to the Civil War. The plantation class culture is destroyed. The elites, those who steered the Southern culture and economy, their whole livelihood and identity and purpose of being and manhood and respect and honor, all that was founded upon slavery and white supremacy. The more slaves you owned in the South, the more you were respected and honored. You were the pinnacle of Southern society. Now that's all gone. And many of these people move out west to get away from Reconstruction, to get away from the feds. And a lot of them come to Central California and the West. Fresno was founded by a large group of ex-plantation owners who came as far west as they can come without going to the Bay Area, where a lot of Union soldiers were. This was the last of the Wild West. And Fresno was founded by many ex-Confederates fleeing Reconstruction to get away from Washington, D.C. The end of the unique Southern way of life, founded upon the ownership of Black bodies, yet white supremacy continued. Just because there are no more hostilities and armies are no longer fighting each other, does not mean that white supremacy is over, as we'll see. With defeat comes humiliation and lingering distrust of Northern values and people. The South is allowed to create and nurture the lost cause. Confederate flags are flown and monuments erected to Confederate leaders from the end of the Civil War far into the 20th century. The results of the Civil War for African Americans: the end of 225 years of slavery. So I was saying 250, it's actually 225. If we count 1640 as the first as the dates. Some people count 1619, but I'll count in 1640. 1640 was the first time an African man who was previously an indentured servant, he is sentenced to a life of slavery by a judge in New England. The first time in American history, sentenced to a life of servitude. And from that point on, blacks start becoming slaves for life. 4 million slaves gained freedom. White supremacy brutally imposed in the South, KKK, black codes, and Jim Crow laws. The legacy of the Civil War for the United States. Issue of slavery and extreme states' rights settled once and for all. Slavery is outlawed once and for all. A nation politically divided from 1865 to, in many ways, the present time. If you've been following current events, many of these issues are lingering in the US. Sectional divides, regional divides, political divides founded upon cultures that go back before the Civil War, or nations divided by race. Many of these things stemming from the Civil War. Secession settled. States cannot secede. Secede means to break away from. The USA is one nation, North and South, bound. Not the many United States, but the one bound nation of the United States. The United States is once and for all a singular, proper noun, going from the United States are to the United States is. Through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, or Reconstruction constitutional amendments, freedom and rights are extended to African Americans. Keep this in mind as we enter 1865. 60,000 young men come home without legs and arms. 60,000 come home without legs and arms. When we think of PTSD, we often think of our modern conflicts, right? You might have friends, or you might be somebody who has come home from Afghanistan, and you might have PTSD, or your friends might have PTSD, or your dad. But these young men coming home from Gettysburg, where 51,000 died around them, where up to 800,000 young men died around them. There are some reports where bodies were as high as walls at some of these conflicts. Imagine a wall of young men, dead young men, fellow Americans piled up in walls. There's so many dead around you. And the nightmares that would have ensued. How does this affect society as these young men come home and are screaming at night? This is hand-to-hand combat. This is bayonets thrusting the bellies and cannon lopping off heads right next to you. This is brutal, brutal warfare. And these young men coming home are terrorized by nightmares at night. And how does this affect society? This has to have a profound effect on Reconstruction and the healing of the nation, and the bitterness against North and South, against white against black, black against white. So much violence during this time period. Reconstruction points to consider. These are very important points to consider. From the Southern white perspective, Reconstruction was a punishment by an intrusive, conquering North who imposed its unwanted vision for America on Southern people and society. Granting blacks rights and freedoms was an attack on the Southern way of life and constituted an existential shift in what it meant to be a Southern man and woman. Now, of course, I'm saying this is from their perspective, right? There are many perspectives here. And when I read and say these things, I'm not placing a moral value on them. I'm saying this is from a white perspective in the South. They view this as an unjust war, an illegal war by an intrusive North. Reconstruction included two major goals, at least from a northern white and black perspective: to heal the nation, that is, to bring the South back into the fold as one nation, bound together in common purpose and unity. Number two, to grant newly freed Black Americans rights and freedoms in order to navigate as citizens in post-war America. These two goals were antithetical to each other from a white Southern perspective. For Reconstruction to work, this is very important, for Reconstruction to work, white Americans had to be on board with a vision for a new America, one based on rights, freedom, and enfranchisement for all. Once white Americans, especially Northern whites, tired of Reconstruction, the national project collapsed. Like the political and regional divisions during the Civil War, describing oppositions is not as easy as North versus South. Divisions were nuanced. A white Southerner may have been wealthy or poor. A white Northerner may have come from the elite manufacturing class or from the poor working class. Each person in their own economic social worlds may have held beliefs and visions for America in stark contrast to their fellow white man from the same region. History is messy. Why did Reconstruction end? Why did it end? Why was the Civil Rights Revolution not successful in the 1870s? What was more important to the nation in 1877 than rights and freedoms afforded to Black Americans? Important questions. Reconstruction was an era that happened and almost happened and didn't happen. In many places, history was erased as whites took back their societies and cultures and political positions and erased Black names from history, like literally erased Black names from history. Here are some important dates I want you to go over. I won't read them all out right now. I'll let you study these important dates. Starting with 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau was established by an act of Congress, and ending with 1877, the Compromise of 1877, when Northern whites tire of the work they have to put in for Reconstruction. And the first goal of Reconstruction is reached, but not the second goal. Federal troops withdraw from the South, and Southern whites take back their culture from Blacks, and the great terror of Jim Crow is ushered in until the Civil Rights Revolution in the 50s and 60s, 1950s and 60s. General Lee's faced when he surrenders in the Appomattox, April 9th, 1865. Lincoln's Reconstruction, before he died, Lincoln's Reconstruction was Reconstruction light. He wanted to pardon all the leaders of the Confederacy, and Lee, when he surrendered, he was allowed to go free. Him and his wife toured Europe, and he came back and lived a life until he died. Was never jailed for his part in the Confederacy. There were the radical Republicans in the North who wanted to bring all the leaders of the Confederacy to court, I suppose, much like the Allies did at Nuremberg with the Nazi leaders, and hang them. But that plan did not win out. The more soft Reconstruction dealing with the Confederate leaders was enacted, and the Confederate leaders were not brought to court, but allowed to come back into Congress, and the nation was healed in that fashion. Here is Lincoln's last speech, 2 days before Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, April 11th, 1865. And Lincoln in this speech says something very important that didn't sit right with many white Americans. A few days before his assassination, Lincoln delivers his last speech in DC. In his speech, he clearly expresses his belief that very intelligent Black men and Black men who had served as Union soldiers should be allowed to vote. He says this on the White House lawn, I believe, and there's an audience there. In the audience, John Wilkes Booth is listening, and he's angered by what Lincoln says because he's a Southerner, he's a Confederate sympathizer, and he's angered and moved by what Lincoln said. And this is what Lincoln says: the amount of constituency, so to speak, on which the new Louisiana government rests, this is part of a larger speech, this is an excerpt, would be more satisfactory to all if it contained 50, 30, or even 20,000 instead of only about 12,000 as it does. It is also unsatisfactory to some that the elective franchise is not given to the colored man. This is the important sentence right here. I would myself prefer that it were now conferred on the very intelligent and on those who serve our cause as soldiers. So Lincoln is not saying I want to give the right to vote to all Black people, because Lincoln has expressed before that he believes that white people are superior. But he's saying from his perspective, there are very intelligent Black people, Black men, and they should be given the right to vote. He's probably referring to men like Frederick Douglass, who we had many conversations with, and the Union soldiers who he believes should be recompensed with voting for their great service to the Union. But many white Americans did not like this, even Northern whites. And John Wilkes Booth was in the audience, and this is what he says to a friend. He turns to a friend while Lincoln was speaking, and he says this to his friend: that is the last speech he will make. 3 days later, as Lincoln is watching a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, John Wilkes Booth gains access to the balcony where Lincoln is sitting with his wife, and he shoots Lincoln in the back of the head. April 14th, 1865, and Lincoln dies the next day. And the greatest manhunt ever, up until probably this manhunt that's going on with the FBI and the Capitol rioters, but up until that point, this was the biggest manhunt in the U.S. history to find John Wilkes Booth. He was eventually found and in a barn, and it burned down, and there was a firefight. A gunfight, and the barn burned. He died. Men I want you to know: Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson becomes president when Lincoln dies. He is a Southerner, as I said in the beginning of this lecture. There are various types of Southerners. He wasn't part of the elite class, but he was a poor Southerner who despised the upper elite class. He was a loyal Unionist, even though he was a Southerner. So the Southerners see him as a traitor because he was loyal to the Union during the Civil War. So I'll read this out. Loyal Union, war Democrat from Tennessee. The South saw him as a traitor. He championed the cause of the Southern man, the poor white man, but vilified the planter class. He was not recognized by Southern elites. And this really bothered him, that he wasn't part of their club. He was an outsider. They despised him. As a member of the House of Representatives and the Senate in the 1840s and 50s, he advocated a homestead bill to provide a free farm for the poor white man. So he was truly a champion of the poor white man. But of course, he was also a white supremacist and a Southerner in that fashion. In 1868, while he was president, he pardoned all rebel leaders. And as I mentioned before, this was in opposition to the radical Republicans who wanted to bring the Confederate leaders to court and hang them. But he pardoned the Confederate leaders. He said, if you come to Washington, D.C., before me and pledge allegiance to the United States of America, then you will be pardoned and you'll be allowed to serve again and be part of the Union. So in 1868, he pardoned all rebel leaders who came to him in Washington and swore allegiance to the USA. He was opposed by radical Republicans and wealthy Southerners. President Andrew Johnson. POTUS number 17, President of the United States. The Freedmen's Bureau is established in 1865 to aid former Blacks, this is a typo, and poor whites in the aftermath of the US Civil War. The Bureau provided food, housing, and medical aid, established schools, and offered legal assistance. The Bureau made a promise. This is a very important factor right here. So let me ask you this question. When 4 million African Americans are freed during this, at 1865, when hostilities cease and Lee surrenders, and 4 million African Americans are free, what do? Think about this. Where do they go? Where do they work? They just can't go down the street and get a job at McDonald's or in the construction crew like many of you can. There's nowhere for them to work, except where? Where would you think they might get jobs at? When they're freed, who needs workers? The plantation where they grew up as slaves, right? What's another way they can make a living? Well, if they have their own land. Remember, land has always been part of making it for yourself in America. When poor young Irish and Scottish young men and women come over as indentured servants in the 17th, 18th centuries, they come over for land, for freedom and land. They serve their 7 years as an indentured servant. They get a little money, they buy land. Land is the basis for freedom in America. The Homestead Act, Lincoln's Homestead Act. Land, own your own property, be a property owner. So this is one way that African Americans hope to gain honor and dignity is to be farmers. And the Bureau makes a promise to newly freed African Americans that the land that was confiscated from Southern elites in the South will be divided up and given to them. And there is great hope and jubilation. They are going to have a piece of the American dream. They're going to have 40 acres and a mule. And they're going to be their own men and women. They're going to be pioneers. And this fills them with great joy. And the Bureau makes this promise. The federal government makes this promise to African Americans that they're going to receive land. This promise of land gave Blacks hope, finally, to determine their own destinies. Many even settled on this land. They began to build their lives. They built cabins. They started tilling the ground. Can you imagine what that felt like? Having been a slave and now you own your own land and you're planting your own crops? The dignity and honor and respect that you have as a man and a woman, doing it for yourself, that's what America's about, right? Doing it for yourself. And they were doing it. The government, however, reneged on the promise of land. Since confiscated lands were given back to white Southerners. This shattered the hopes and placed Blacks at the mercy of former masters and racist white communities. Now put yourself in their shoes. You planted your crops, you built your cabin, your wife's pregnant, you're your own person. And the feds come and say, man, sorry about that. We made a promise, but we're taking back this land to give to your former plantation owner. And he needs workers, so go hit him up for a job. Due to a lack of funds and personnel, along with fierce opposition from southern states, the Bureau shut down. Here's a drawing of the Freedmen's Bureau from Harper's Weekly. Harper's Weekly was a prominent newspaper at this time. We see these African Americans coming for help, for aid. And of course, the opposition to the idea of rights and freedoms for Blacks was often in print and often showed African Americans as kind of like, if you've watched Lord of the Rings, Gollum, this is how often African Americans were portrayed, as that kind of creature, right? Tricky, not bright, but tricky, obsequious. Look up that word. It's a powerful word, obsequious, like cringy, and always happy and lazy and monkey-like. This is how the African American was often portrayed in cartoons and newspapers by those who saw African Americans as subhuman. So this is an anti-Freedmen's Bureau pamphlet printed by the Democratic Party. And of course, don't confuse modern Democrat Republican parties with what was then the Democrat Republican Party. They're totally different. They're only similar in name, but the ideologies and people who made up those parties are so totally different than what they are now. The Democrat Party at that time was the party of slavery, the party of white supremacy, generally speaking, the party of the South, that opposed Black rights, opposed Black freedoms. And this flyer was from the Pennsylvania Congressional and Gubernatorial Campaign, Democratic Party, that shows this African American looks like he's lazy, doesn't want to work, and he's very cartoonish. The manhood has been stripped from him, and this is often the case when peoples are seen as subhuman. Manhood is stripped from these men, and this is why white Southerners would often call African American boys, because it's a term to strip the manhood away from African men. Horrible. The Freedmen's Bureau. The collapse of the Freedmen's Bureau ushered in a new phenomenon called sharecropping. The Freedmen's Bureau's, sorry, that's a typo. I need to fix that. Unfulfilled promise of land forced many newly freed slaves into economic contracts with former slave owners. They had to work. The Freedmen's Bureau unfulfilled promise of land meant they were landless. They had to find a job, and many of them went to work on the plantations where they were born. No longer slave plantations. Contracts between landowners and sharecroppers were typically harsh and restrictive. Landowners could have access to the large labor force necessary to grow cotton. They did not need to pay these laborers money, a major benefit in a post-war Georgia or South that was cash poor but land rich. Black sharecroppers worked land owned mostly by white ex-slave owners. Sharecroppers bought seeds and materials, food and clothing from the landowner, usually at high interest rates. Many contracts forbade sharecroppers from saving cotton seeds from their harvest, forcing them to increase their debt by obtaining seeds from a landowner. At harvest, sharecroppers gave a large portion, usually about half, of their crop to the landowner and settled any debts, usually leaving the sharecropper in further debt and tied to the land. In many ways, sharecropping was a type of semi-freedom. This is an important speech that was given in 1861. Now, even though it's before Reconstruction, at the start of the Civil War, it's very important because this ideology continues. Just because the Civil War ends does not mean that the ideology of white supremacy ends. And this is important because this man who gives this speech, Alexander Stevens, is the vice president of the CSA, the Confederate States of America. From 1861 to 1865, he's the vice president. But also, he's in Congress, the House of Representatives during Reconstruction. He's a major force during Reconstruction as he battles and opposes Black rights and freedoms. From 1873 to 1882, he's also, this is a typo, not George governor, but Georgia governor. From 1882 to 1883, he's Georgia's governor. So he's a major player throughout the Civil War and throughout Reconstruction. And this excerpt here is from his most famous speech and one of the most important speeches in American history, the Cornerstone Speech, 1861. And now you'll hear maybe not many people, but those who subscribe to the lost cause myth, the lost cause religion, will say that slavery was not the main issue. The South did not go to war over slavery. The South went to war because an intrusive North invaded the South and tried to impose its culture upon the South. But if you go back and read the documents that the South was issuing at the start of the Civil War, the South explicitly says, we are fighting for slavery. We are fighting for white supremacy. They don't say that the main issue is states' rights. They make it very clear. In 1861, they make it very clear, we are fighting to keep slavery alive. Our culture is founded upon slavery and the proposition that men are not all created equal, that white people are superior to Black people. And the vice president of the Confederacy says this, and here's the excerpt that lingers on beyond the Civil War into Reconstruction. And this is part of what he says. But not to be tedious in enumerating the numerous changes for the better, allow me to allude to one another, though last not least. The new Constitution has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institution, African slavery, as it exists amongst us, the proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization. This was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. So he is saying African slavery was the cause of the Civil War, the late rupture and present revolution he's referring to as the Civil War. Jefferson, in his forecast, had anticipated this as a rock upon which the old Union would split. He was right. What was conjecture with him is now a realized fact. But whether he fully comprehended the great truth upon which that rock stood and stands may be doubted. He's referring to Thomas Jefferson. The prevailing ideas entertained by him, Thomas Jefferson, and most of the leading statesmen, Jefferson, Washington, Adams, Hamilton, at that time of the formation of the old Constitution, and when he refers to the old Constitution, he means the Constitution of the United States compared to the new, better Constitution of the Confederate States of America. He's saying the old Constitution were that the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle, socially, morally, and politically. Now we'll stop right there. If you read the Founding Fathers, Jefferson had slaves, Washington had slaves, many of the Founding Fathers had slaves. But if you read their diaries, they're torn. Jefferson is torn by slavery. He knows that his whole livelihood is founded upon the ownership of Black bodies. His mistress is a mulatto African American woman. He has kids with her. There are many descendants today who are Black, who are descended from Jefferson. And he is morally torn. He knows that slavery is evil, but he's not going to let his slaves free because his whole livelihood depends on it. And Washington and Jefferson believe that one day it must go away, that it's not the best thing for America. But here, Alexander Stevens is saying, Jefferson and Washington Adams, they all grappled with slavery, but they were wrong because Jefferson and Washington believed that this is in violation of God's order, that somehow God instituted, but in the end, it shouldn't be this way. And Stevens says they were wrong. Jefferson was wrong. Washington was wrong. Slavery is morally right. And our new Constitution and nation is founded upon the universal truth that Negroes should be enslaved by white Americans. And that is the truth of the foundation of our society. I'll go on. It was an evil they knew not well how to deal with, the founding fathers. But the general opinion of the men of that day was that somehow or other, in the order of providence, the institution would be evanescent and pass away. This idea, though not incorporated in the Constitution, was the prevailing idea at the time. The Constitution, it is true, secured every essential guarantee to the institution while it should last, and hence no argument should be justly urged against the constitutional guarantees thus secured because of the common sentiment of the day. Those ideas, however, were fundamentally wrong. Washington was wrong. Jefferson was wrong. Adams was wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of races. This was an error. It was a sandy foundation, and the government built upon it fell when the storm came and the wind blew. So he foresees the end of the United States of America because their Constitution is founded upon the equality of races. That he sees the seeds of equality in the Constitution that will eventually lead to the equality of all races. And he says that is bad. That's going to fall apart because that can't stand. Races can't get along. Whites are superior, and the United States will fall apart. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery's subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. Powerful speech, one of the most important speeches in American history, probably one of the least taught speeches in American history also. White Supremacy and the KKK. These are early Klan costumes before Hollywood would make the uniform universal in 1915. That's another lecture. In 1868, the KKK boasted over 500,000 members across the South. At its peak in 1920s, the KKK had over 4 million members. Some estimates now say up to 6 to 8 million members during the 1920s. 1924 was the peak of KKK membership in the United States. Between 1870 and 1871, Congress passed the Enforcement Acts, which made it a crime to interfere with registration, voting, office holding, or jury service of Blacks. More than 5,000 people were indicted under these laws. A little more than 1,000 were convicted. The KKK leadership was brought to court by the feds, and they were put in prison, the leaders. The acts included the KKK Act. Hundreds were jailed under President Grant's administration. This is Ulysses S. Grant, who fought as a Union war general, who became president after Andrew Johnson. Here's another man I want you to know, Nathan Bedford Forrest, the first Grand Wizard of the KKK, served as Grand Wizard 1867 to 1869 during Reconstruction. Nathan Bedford Forrest, a slave trader. He owned and operated a slave market in downtown Memphis in the 1850s, served as a lieutenant general in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. After the Civil War, he became the first Grand Wizard in the newly formed Ku Klux Klan. Here's an early Klan costume. before the white garments became universal? Why did the Klan form in December 1865? What factors led to a small group of men forming the KKK? The KKK formed as a bulwark against the programs of the North in order to inflict terror on the newly freed 4 million African Americans in the South, to impose violence so that white supremacy continued to be the foundation of Southern society, denying any of the freedoms passed for the North, namely the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Through intimidation, violence, and murder, the KKK terrorized Black communities for over 100 years. Why do we even study the Klan? Why is it important to know the history of the Klan in American history? What do you think? Let me pose that question to you. Why should we study the Klan? Note, the Klan is allowed to exist in America today. Why is the Klan allowed to exist, knowing its history? That won't be a test question. I just want to pose that question to you. Think about these things. Another man I want you to know, General Robert E. Lee, 1865 to 1869. Now there's the man, Robert E. Lee, who was the Confederate general, and then there's the Confederate saint, Robert E. Lee, who lives on even after his death as a major icon in the lost cause myth or lost cause public religion. Virginia elite blue blood, soldier, general, commander of the Confederate States Army, and college president after the Civil War. They're allowed to go free, travel Europe, and come back as a college president. He was at first offered the command of the U.S. Army. He accepted Lincoln's command of the Union Army. But when Virginia claimed the Confederacy, he was a fierce loyalist of his homeland, Virginia, and went and accepted the commission of commander of the Confederate forces in order to protect Virginia. He wasn't a big proponent of slavery. He didn't fight the war to protect slavery, but protect Virginia. That was him as a man. Him as an icon of the Confederate lost cause myth is something different. He will live on as a larger than life figure in the minds of lost cause devotees up until the present time. Upon his death, was transformed into Confederate hero and deified into the patron saint of the lost cause. A very important man during Reconstruction, the Northern Radical Republican, Thaddeus Stevens, lived from 1792 to 1868. Lawyer, congressman, statesman, fierce proponent of Black rights. This is a man we should all know. Advocate of universal education, an adamant and outspoken critic of slavery and discrimination against African Americans, and champion of total and complete equal rights and enfranchisement. He was called a radical, the radical Republican. Opponent of President Andrew Johnson, an enemy to Southern Democrats and moderate Republicans. Here are a couple quotes by Thaddeus Stevens. The whole fabric of Southern society must be changed, and never can it be done if this opportunity is lost. Without this, the government can never be, as it never has been, a true republic. September 6, 1865. And this is what he said earlier during his career. I wish that I were the owner of every Southern slave, that I might cast off the shackles from their limbs and witness the rapture which would excite them in the first dance of their freedom. Beautiful, beautiful quote. Ulysses S. Grant lived from 1822 to 1885, general of the Union Army, POTUS number 18. served from 1869 to 1877 as President of the United States of America. Soldier, statesman, West Point graduate. He was born into the working class. He wasn't a blue blood elite like Robert E. Lee, but working class, Methodist background. Victorious commanding general of the United States Army, president of the US. He served two terms in office, overseeing most of Reconstruction. Remember, Andrew Johnson served from 1865 to his presidency. Andrew Johnson didn't attend his inauguration the same way that Trump didn't attend Biden's inauguration. During Reconstruction, created the Department of Justice, prosecuting the KKK under the KKK Act, aligned with radical Republicans. Here's a powerful quote from Gren, 1875. If we are to have another contest in the near future of our national existence, I predict that the dividing line will not be Masons and Dixons, but between patriotism and intelligence on one side, and superstition, ambition, and ignorance on the other. Now, in this centennial year of our national existence, I believe it is a good time to begin the work of strengthening the foundation of the house commenced by our patriotic forefathers 100 years ago at Concord and Lexington. Another powerful American during this time, Frederick Douglass, and perhaps the type of man that Lincoln was referring to when he said that very intelligent Black men should be given the right to vote. Frederick Douglass had a few conversations with Lincoln. Social reformer, abolitionist. An abolitionist meant someone who wanted to abolish slavery. Orator, writer, and statesman, civil rights and women's rights advocate. Born a slave to a Black mother and white father, who he never knew, grew up on a plantation. At 21, he ran away to New York and published a newspaper, Frederick Douglass's paper. Throughout the Civil War, he advised and consulted Lincoln on slavery issues. In 1882, The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. It's a powerful read, you should read it. Here are a couple of quotes by this amazing American Frederick Douglass. Education means emancipation. It means light and liberty. It means the uplifting of the soul of man into the glorious light of truth, the light by which man can only be made free. Remember, Thomas Jefferson said that if democracy in America is to work, then democracy can only work with educated citizens. Keep that in mind. Be a person who has a home library, read books, be educated, know things. Here's a second quote by Frederick Douglass. No man can be truly free whose liberty is dependent upon the thought, feeling, and action of others, and who has himself no means in his own hands of guarding, protecting, defending, and maintaining that liberty. The lost cause myth includes the following. The main reason the South fought the Civil War was to fend off the Northern Union invasion of their sovereign lands. Loyalty and defense of their homelands was a primary cause. Southern states' rights were violated and at stake. According to the lost cause, slavery was not the main reason for the bloody conflict. Number two, the South was a defender of Christian ideals and a vanguard against the evil, greedy, and immoral North. In Southern rural culture, American ideals grew, but diminished in the North. Blacks were happy as slaves and loyal to their masters. Black slaves led better lives and were better fed and healthier than poor whites in the North. Industrialization stripped poor white men of dignity and relegated them to poverty. 4, a deep cult-like reverence for dead Confederate heroes like Robert E. Lee. 5, groups like the KKK stood as guardians of Southern morality, culture, and pride. 6, a cherished belief the South will one day rise again, the lost cause myth. Here's the Confederate Memorial at Arlington, erected in 1914. Many, I would say most of the Confederate statues and memorials that are around today were erected 1 or 2 generations after the Civil War, many in the early 20th century. So here is a Confederate memorial, and right here we see an African-American Confederate soldier going off to fight to defend Southern culture. Here we see a Black mammy who is taking care of a Union soldier's babies while he goes off and fights the war. This is the idea that Black slaves were happy in the South and defenders of the Confederate cause, part of the lost cause myth. Here's a poster after the Civil War, Heroes of Our Flag. Here are all the major politicians and generals of the Confederate cause kept alive after the Civil War. Here's a close-up. Beauregard, who was a Confederate general, Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederate States of America, and Alexander Stephens, who gave that speech on white supremacy and slavery, vice president of the Confederacy. All heroes of the lost cause. Mississippi's flag, up until 2020, had the Confederate battle flag as part of their flag. The state flag of Mississippi from February 1894 to June 30th, 2020 included the Confederate battle flag in the upper left corner. This is a really crazy fact. Mississippi did not ratify the 13th Amendment outlawing slavery until 1995. That's not a typo. It's not supposed to say 1895, but literally 1995, the 13th Amendment was finally ratified in Mississippi outlawing slavery. What do you think about that? Here's a map showing the distribution of Confederate monuments across the United States. A few in California. Mostly, of course, mostly in the South, right? As of 2016, 1,747 Confederate monuments, symbols, and statues still stood mostly in the South as heroic reminders of a lost cause and its heroes. This map shows their distribution across the US. This is a photo that came out 3 weeks ago during the Capitol riots. Here's a man standing inside the Capitol building holding the Confederate flag, a devotee of the lost cause. Capitol insurrectionist Kevin Seafried, seen here inside the Capitol holding his Confederate flag. He was arrested by the FBI shortly after. Kevin admitted to investigators in a volunteer interview that he had brought the Confederate flag from his home in Delaware, where it is usually displayed outside. Lost cause. He's now in prison or he's in jail awaiting trial. The 13th Amendment, one of the 3 important amendments to come out of Reconstruction. Here is the text from the 13th Amendment. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Now it's saying slavery is outlawed, except for those who are in jail or in prison, then they could be used as slaves. This is what the 13th Amendment says. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Ratified December 6, 1865. The 13th Amendment, very important, outlawing slavery once and for all in the United States. The Black Codes, and if you were in my class, I assigned this homework in History 12, the Black Codes. And as I said when I began this lecture, the North passes legislation and the South fights back. So the North passes the 13th Amendment, the South fights back with the KKK and the Black Codes. In 1865, immediately following the defeat in the Civil War, several Southern states passed harsh, restrictive laws called Black Codes. Mississippi passed the harshest of such laws. The Black Codes made certain that white supremacy continued to dictate Southern societies by legally placing Blacks into tightly controlled niches that bound their movement and ownership of labor and bodies. The modern carceral system of prison labor was born from the 13th Amendment and Black Codes. Remember, from the 13th Amendment, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime. Except. Slavery is outlawed except if you're a prisoner, a criminal put in jail, then your labor can be used without giving you pay as slave labor. And this happens in the South. A horrible effect of this great, wonderful amendment, the 13th Amendment, is that prison labor is legal, unfortunately. When I say unfortunately, that's my own opinion. I'm not going to test you on that, right? Sometimes I give my opinion. I try not to, but you'll never be tested on my opinion. Vagrancy law. There are several laws throughout several states that are Black Codes, and this is one of the most egregious controlling laws issued by Mississippi. This is an excerpt from the larger vagrancy law. Section 1, be it enacted by the legislature of the state of Mississippi that all rogues and vagabonds, idle and dissipated persons, beggars, jugglers, or persons practicing unlawful games or plays, runaways, common drunkards, common nightwalkers, pilferers, lewd, wanton, or lascivious persons in speech or behavior, common railers and brawlers, persons who neglect their calling or employment, misspend what they earn, or do not provide for the support of themselves or their families or dependents, and all other idle or disorderly persons, including all who neglect lawful business or habitually misspend their time by frequenting houses of ill fame, gaming houses, or tipping shops, shall be deemed and considered vagrants under the provisions of this act, and on conviction thereof shall be fined not exceeding $100. Now, $100 at that time was a lot of money. I don't know what the conversion rate. I would say like maybe $1,000 for people who had just come out of slavery with no money, right? With all accruing costs, shall be imprisoned at the discretion of the court, not exceeding 10 days. Now think about that. All those descriptions, these are African Americans who had just now gained their freedom. They don't have any work or jobs. From this law's perspective, they're all idle. This gives Mississippi police and judges and municipalities the legal rights to imprison basically any African American they see walking around. Because who has jobs? Think about the effect this would have had on society. This would have pushed African Americans to immediately find work on the plantations they grew up on, forced them back into that position as sharecroppers, and put a lot of them in jail. That's a wide net they're casting. They're very, of course, from any perspective, this is an unjust, immoral law made to entrap newly freed African Americans and put them in jail and use their labor as prison labor to rebuild the Southern society. Section 2, be it further enacted that all freedmen, freed Negroes, and mulatto means half black, half white, in this state over the age of 18 years old, found on the second Monday, January 1866 or thereafter, with no lawful employment. Now, again, they've just been free. Many of them don't have jobs because there's no work to be had. So this is saying with no lawful employment or business, or found unlawfully assembling themselves together in the day or nighttime, and all, now listen to this, and all white persons so assembling with freedmen, freed Negroes, or mulattoes, or usually associating with freedmen, free Negroes, or mulattoes on terms of equality, or living in adultery or fornication with a freed woman or free Negro or mulatto shall be deemed vagrants. So it's saying you cannot have a black, if you're white and you have black friends, you're going to be put in jail. You're a vagrant. If you have a black girlfriend, you're a vagrant. If you have a black boyfriend, you're a vagrant. You're going to be put in jail. Think about the effect this would have had on society. For those people who, it probably wasn't very widespread, but I'm assuming that there were white people who had black friends following the Civil War. Or God forbid, right? A white woman and a black man, all those relationships are cut off because they are now illegal. Horrible law. I'll continue. Shall be deemed vagrants, and on conviction thereof, shall be fined in the sum of not exceeding, in the case of a freedman, freed Negro, mulatto, $150, and a white man, $200. So it's a larger crime for a white man to have black friends or a black girlfriend. $200, that's a lot of money in a society that's destroyed, where the economy is destroyed. Nobody has money. You're a young white man and you have a black girlfriend and you guys are in love. And this law says that's now illegal and you're going to pay $200, you're going to jail, buddy. And in prison, at the discretion of the court, the free Negro not exceeding 10 days and the white man not exceeding 6 months. Going to jail for having a black girlfriend or a black friend. Mississippi, 1865, 1866. There are several massacres that take place in the South. So there's a Black Codes, there are groups like the KKK, and other groups that form as what we would call now terrorist organizations. They actually terrorize black families. They lynch mostly black men in front of their families. They beat black people. And then we also have massacres where whole neighborhoods of people, churches and schools are destroyed. People are murdered by groups of angry white men. We started our lecture off by saying, imagine you're a white man, a white person living in Charleston, and your city's destroyed. And your father, your cousin, they died in the Civil War. And you're looking out and you're seeing these black people in jubilation because they received their freedom. From your perspective, you're angry and bitter. And when jobs do start cropping up, when the South is starting to be built up again, blacks and whites compete for those jobs. And white people are so pissed off because they have to compete with black people for jobs. This is why there are riots and massacres in the South. Because working class whites and poor whites are competing with newly freed blacks. And seeing these young, powerful, young black men coming back to the South who fought for the Union in Union uniforms in their streets in jubilation over their newfound freedom. And this angers working class poor whites. The Memphis Massacre. The Memphis Massacre or riots occurred in May 1866 following the Civil War. Racial tensions were high between free blacks and whites. Police brutality and harassment of black citizens fanned the flames of antagonism. Returning black soldiers and white police officers fired upon one another, igniting 3 days of racial conflict. Whites rampaged through black neighborhoods, killing, raping, and burning properties. In the end, 46 black citizens lay dead, and every black church and school burned to the ground. The Memphis Massacre was merely the first of many such horrible conflicts to ignite throughout the nation, in both the South and North, as whites and blacks fought over one another's place in post-war America. Another massacre took place in New Orleans in July 1866. The two massacres influenced the passage of the 14th Amendment, as radical Republicans realized newly freed African Americans needed protection under the law. During this massacre, the Memphis Massacre, 46 black and 2 white people were killed, 75 black people injured, over 100 black persons robbed, 5 black women raped, 91 homes, 4 churches, and 8 schools, all black owned, were burned to the ground in the black community. Every church and every school was burned to the ground. Imagine there were 8 schools. There were 8 schools educating young African Americans, full of hope and promise for the future, and their schools burned down. Here are some woodcuts. I think woodcuts or etchings from this event. We see these blacks being massacred, black men dead, schoolhouse being burned to the ground by white mobs. These poor kids. Here are the list of massacres. I won't read them all out, but just take a look at them. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There are 10 major massacres during Reconstruction. So we have pushback by white politicians. We have pushback by white society. We have massacres with the KKK. And all these things will eventually cause the collapse of the Reconstruction period. The South fights back very hard against this idea of freed African Americans and their right to vote, and the right to vote African Americans into Congress, into the Senate. The Reconstruction Act of 1867, important act. The act outlined the terms for readmission to representation of rebel states. The act divided the former Confederate states, except for Tennessee, into 5 military districts. So at this time, the South was occupied by the North. Each state was required to ratify the 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution. Each state was required to write a new constitution, which needed to be approved by a majority of voters, including African Americans in that state. After meeting these criteria related to protecting the rights of African Americans and their property, the former Confederate states could gain full recognition and federal representation in Congress. On June 27, 1868, Arkansas became the first state to be admitted to representation under those terms. Here's a map showing the 5 military districts the South was divided into. The date of their readmission to the Union in bold. Enfranchisement, great hope for African Americans as they're elected to Congress, elected to the Senate. The Civil Rights Revolution was happening at this time. Think about this. African American men were becoming legislators, sitting in the halls of Congress. Amazing, amazing. Approximately 2,000 African Americans held public office during Reconstruction, from local positions to the US Senate, though they never achieved representation in government proportionate to their numbers. Democratic opponents who vehemently criticized blacks holding office called their legislatures and conventions monkey houses. Here is an illustration again from Harper's Weekly, the newspaper we already took a look at. And here are black legislators characterized as goonish, cartoonish, ghoulish, subhuman in many ways, right? Here are these whites saying, oh my God, look what we got to deal with. And they're fighting and shouting and carrying on. And here's Columbia. I believe it says Columbia. Columbia was the representation of America in the early republic. and not so much in the 20th century as Uncle Sam and the Statue of Liberty take over the iconography of America. Before that, Columbia was a representation of America. So here is Colombia up here trying to get peace and order, and here African Americans in Congress fighting like idiots. They weren't in actuality, but this is the way that many white Americans saw them. And this is the caption down here, up here. Colored rule in a Reconstruction state. The members call each other thieves, liars, rascal. So these African Americans are yelling at each other, you thief, no, you coward, no, you rascal. And the whites are like, oh my God, look what we got to deal with. And Columbia is back there saying, you are aping the lowest whites. If you disgrace your race in this way, you had better take back seats. Horrible representation of these very dignified, honorable men, intelligent, dignified men who are African American. This is the way many white Americans are seeing these legislators. And this is a quote from Alexander Abrams, who's a white legislator who compiled the legislative manual each year, announced that he was going to omit Black lawmakers from biographical sketches. This is why I said this was a moment in history that was erased in many ways. This goes back to my initial lecture, what is history? What is history? If history is not recorded, did it ever take place? Many times, nations choose not to remember certain periods of their history, or archives are locked up, and history is not known until decades or centuries after it actually occurred. And here's a legislator saying, I am going to erase the names of these Black people so that nobody will know that they served. And this is what he says. I am not going to include these Black legislators because it would be absurd to record the lives of men who were but yesteryear our slaves, and whose past careers embraced such occupations as boot blacking, shaving, table waiting, and the like. So we not only have like racial antagonism, but there's class antagonism also, right? Fascinating. The 14th Amendment, one of the three important amendments. This is what it says. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state to deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So the 13th Amendment outlawed slavery, and the 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection under the law to all Americans. Ratified July 9th, 1868. The 15th Amendment, the third of the great three amendments of Reconstruction period. Section 1, the right of citizens of the United States to vote, right? This is so important. Such an important element of American citizenship is the democratic right to vote. I'll read it again. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Ratified February 3rd, 1870. And I want to look at three very important African American figures that are elected to Congress during this time. Now think of the caricatures we saw in the Anti-Freedmen Bureau's Democratic flyer. How the character looked like something out of Lord of the Rings, looked like Gollum, this lazy, obsequious, happy-go-lucky, stupid character the African American men are portrayed out. And the one from Harper's Weekly with the three African American legislators arguing in Congress. and the white congressmen are like, oh man, look what we have to deal with. That's what the nation is viewing. This is the portraits and caricatures of African American men until we have the photograph. Bam, powerful. These are men just like you. This is what these portraits say. And these are printed, and wow, these are powerful men, just like powerful white men. They're not monkeys. They're not some obsequious creature. These are men, handsome, powerful, intelligent, men with vision, just like white men. They're human beings with the same possibilities and talents and visions for America than white men, as white men. Here's the first man. Hiram Rhodes Revels, Senator, South Carolina, 1870-71. Born free, of course, a Republican, U.S. Senator, president of the Alcorn Agricultural and Mechanical College, and minister in the African Methodist Episcopalian Church. He was the first Black person to serve in the United States House of Representatives, and the second Black person to serve in the United States Congress. And here's a great quote from Mr. Revels. The colored race can be built up and assisted in acquiring property and becoming intelligent, valuable, and useful citizens without one hair upon the head of any white man being harmed. That's a great quote, because think about this. How do Black freedoms and rights harm white Southern citizens? Because white Southerners are opposing left and right at every turn. They're opposing Black freedoms and rights. How are they harmed if Black people are acquiring equal rights and freedoms and voting rights and being voted into Congress? How is that harming the hairs on the head of the white man? Another caricature of these Black creatures murdering Louisiana. And every one of the southern states is dressed like Columbia, and they're all going to be sacrificed on the altar of radicalism. And here's Grant with a demon or Satan talking in his ear. Yes, destroy the South, destroy the moral South. And here are these Blacks who just taking out the heart of Louisiana by this radical Republican. Here's these very dignified, intelligent African-American men, the first colored senator and representatives in the 41st and 42nd Congress of the United States. The Civil Rights Revolution is happening now at that time. Here's a beautiful portrait of Revels. And Frederick Douglass writes a letter to the journal who publishes the painting. I'll let you read that and go on, but a very powerful portrait. Of course, in stark contrast to how African-American men were being portrayed as these obsequious monkey creatures. Here's a very powerful, dignified man who is serving his nation. Joseph Rainey, Congress, South Carolina, 5 terms in Congress, the 41st to the 45th, 1869 to 1879. He served through most of Reconstruction. Born a free person and never a slave, that's from the first senator. Here's a quote. Here's a quote by Rainey. I can only raise my voice, Rainey said in 1877, and I would do it if it were the last time I ever did it, in defense of my rights and the interests of my oppressed people. The last, I believe it's the last, yes, I wish I can go through all of these powerful, intelligent visionaries, African American visionaries. Please Google Reconstruction African American politicians and read more about them. Robert Brown Elliott, Congress, South Carolina, the 42nd and 43rd Congress. And this is a quote. Well, this is actually a debate he had with Alexander Stephens, who was a proponent of white supremacy and gave the cornerstone speech. And he actually gave a rebuttal speech to Alexander's speech the day before. And this is an excerpt. Sir, it is scarcely 12 years since that gentleman, Vice President Alexander Stephens, shocked the civilized world by announcing the birth of a government which rested upon human slavery as its cornerstone. Now he's referring to that speech we just talked about. The progress of events has swept away that pseudo-government which rested on greed, pride, and tyranny. And the race whom he then ruthlessly spurned and trampled on are here to meet him in debate and to demand that the rights which are enjoyed by their former oppressors, who vainly sought to overthrow a government which they could not prostitute to the base uses of slavery, shall be accorded to those who, even in the darkness of slavery, kept their allegiance true to freedom and the Union. Wow, that's a powerful excerpt from a powerful speech by this powerful young man. On January 6, 1874, Congressperson Robert B. Elliott of South Carolina gave a speech to advocate for the Civil Rights Act. When federal troops were withdrawn from South Carolina in 1877, Elliott was forced from office. He died in poverty, August 9, 1844, at the age of 41. Reconstruction ended in 1877, and he died in poverty. Think of the great work these men would have done if Reconstruction hadn't come to an end. The Colfax Massacre, another massacre, one of the several I showed you. Historian Eric Foner, who is the author of our textbooks, one of the most well-known historians alive today, the foremost historian on Reconstruction, says the bloodiest single instance of racial carnage in the Reconstruction era, the Colfax Massacre, taught many lessons, including the lengths to which some opponents of Reconstruction would go to gain their accustomed white supremacist authority. This is what happens in a nutshell. The 1873 Louisiana gubernatorial election was hotly contested between Southern Democrats and Black Republicans supported by the North. When President Grant sent federal troops into the state to keep the peace, the White League was formed, much like the KKK, to stand guard against Northern intrusion and local Blacks. The bitter antagonisms between the two groups resulted in the worst Black massacre of the period, as whites lashed out in rage against former slaves. 3 white men and up to 150 Black men died. Sorry, there's typos there. The Compromise of 1877 and the end of Reconstruction. By 1877, whites on both sides of the old Mason-Dixon line had tired of Reconstruction. To many Northern whites, it was time to move on with industry and money-making instead of forever forcing the South to accept Blacks as equal partners in the nation's future. Of course, most Southern whites never accepted the idea that Blacks should be afforded freedom and equality, hence a severe backlash in legislation, intimidation, lynching, and massacres. The Compromise of 1877 was a result of the disputed 1876 US presidential election. The secret political deal ensured that Rutherford Hayes, the moderate Republican candidate, would become the next president, and the Democrats would once again take political power in the Southern state governments. The compromise, or compromise, was a nail in the coffin for Black rights in the South. From this point forward, until the civil rights movement in the 1960s, African Americans would be intimidated and barred from voting, from seeking office, from sitting on juries, from living in certain areas. In some, Southern whites attempted and in many ways succeeded in placing Blacks into confined, oppressed niches. From 1877 to the Civil Rights Movement, white supremacy ruled in the old Confederacy. Remember, two major elements made up Reconstruction. One, healing the nation, bringing the South back into the fold as full Americans. And two, granting African Americans freedoms and rights. In the end, the South was brought back and the nation set toward healing. But this also meant that the Civil Rights Revolution was killed, and it would be another 100 years till it was realized with leaders and people like MLK. Here are three powerful quotes from African Americans during this time. I was free, but there was no one to welcome me to the land of freedom. I was a stranger in a strange land. Attributed to Harriet Tubman. Daddy said he was proud of freedom, but afraid to own it. Daughter of a freed slave. When the war came on to set us free, we was told there would be 40 acres and a mule. We never did. Jenny Webb, former slave. Here's a powerful quote by Frederick Douglass. The law on the side of freedom is of great advantage only when there is power to make that law respected. I think by now, having read this, having gone through this lecture, you know what that means, right? The North passes these three powerful amendments. And while the military is down the South, they're able to enforce it somewhat. And Blacks vote, and then Blacks are voted into office. But once Northern whites tire of supporting the Black cause and pull the military out and make the secret deal that Rutherford Hayes would become the Republican president and the Democrats can have the South back, and the North no longer enforces these laws, and there's no reason why the South should observe these laws and Blacks lose their freedom. Even though these federal laws are still in the books, Washington can pass laws, but if there's something there to back it up, then they're not observed. Now, the next few slides I want to end with are ads taken out by freed African Americans following slavery who are looking for their families. Because we know that during slavery, slave owners often sold children, husbands and wives off to other plantations because they were like cattle, right? They were their bodies that were owned by the slave master. And if he can make a profit by selling off slaves to other slave masters, he often did. And families were disrupted. The Black family was not something that was respected during slavery. So following slavery, when these African Americans gained their freedom, hundreds of ads are taken out looking for loved ones across the nation. Imagine looking for a loved one before the internet, before phones. And the only way you can do this is by placing ads in newspapers. So I'm going to read a few of these out, right? Let me ask you this question before we read these ads. What do the following ads tell us about the slave experience? What do these ads tell us about the experience and lives of freed African Americans following the Civil War? Imagine the heartache of seeing your little brothers and sisters being sold off and knowing you'll never see them again. Or you're a mother and your infant's torn away from your arms and sold off to another plantation. Or your husband and your whole family sold. All these things, right? This is heartbreak, or this is heartache. So here's the first one. Information wanted of my son, Ellen Jones. He left me before the war in Mississippi. He wrote me a letter in 1853 in which letter he said he was sold to the highest bidder, a gentleman in Charleston, South Carolina. Nancy Jones, his mother, would like to know the whereabouts of the above named person. Any information may be sent to Reverend J.W. Turner, pastor of AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Ottawa, Kansas. Information wanted by a mother concerning her children. Miss Elizabeth Williams, who now resides in Marysville, California, was formerly owned together with her children, viz. Lydia, William, Allen, and Parker, by one John Petty, who lived about 6 miles from the town of Woodbury, Franklin County, Tennessee. At that time, she was the wife of Sandy Rucker and was formerly known as Betsy, sometimes called Betsy Petty. About 25 years ago, the mother was sold to Mr. Marshall Stroud, by whom some 12 or 14 years later, she was, for the second time, since purchased by him, taken to Arkansas. She has never seen the above named children since. Any information given concerning them, however, will be greatly received by one whose love for her children survives the bitterness and hardships of many long years spent in slavery. That's heartbreaking, isn't it? Preachers in the neighborhood of Woodbury, Tennessee, are especially requested to make inquiry and communicate any information they may deem valuable, either by letter or through the columns of the recorder. Hiram Bigsby in searching for his wife and children. Hiram Bigsby is searching for information regarding his wife Patsy or his children Margaret, Amos, and Hiram. They were last residing in Missouri. They can hear from their father and receive comfort and aid contacting the editor. San Francisco, 1872. Any of you crying? Elizabeth Powell of Sacramento is searching for her father, mother, and 3 brothers and 2 sisters. Her father, Sam Mosley, was owned by Joe Powell in Kentucky. Elizabeth had belonged to the same man before being sold to speculator Ellis of Louisiana. She is looking for her mother, Elizabeth, brothers Harry, Amos, and Isaac, and her sisters Rebecca and Lucretia. The Elevator, San Francisco, May 27, 1870. Hilary Blandford is searching for Lucinda Blandford, her husband James Blandford, and their children. She has not seen them since 1853. At that time of their separation, Hilary's sister Mary Doherty lived at Bearser. Her mother, father, and her 2 sisters, Martha and Kitty Edwards, as well as Levy Blandford, a baby named Lucinda, and a younger brother lived there too. The rest were scattered around the country. New Orleans, 1885. Our last one. I end on this wonderful story that happened in Fresno, where I am now reading from. Fresno, July 2nd, 1904. After a separation of 45 years, George Harris and Mary J. Brooks, who were slaves upon the same plantation, met in Fresno yesterday. And each having lost a loved one, they decided to finish life together, as they once had planned. They had lived on an old plantation in the state of Louisiana and were lovers when, in 1859, Harris was sold to a planter in Tennessee. They both married in after years. Harris is the father of 17 children, while the woman is a proud mother of 14. By chance, they met yesterday in Fresno. And today, they went to Reverend Father McCarty of St. John's Catholic Church and were married. Miss Harris has lived most of her life in Chicago, coming to Fresno on a visit to relatives. Her old sweetheart is a pioneer resident of this city. Harris is 61 years old and she is 60. The couple will finish their days in Fresno County at Harris's home, north of town, with a large family of 31 will be raised in old plantation style. Fresno, 1904. Well, that wraps up our lecture on Reconstruction, one of the most important eras in American history following the Civil War.